Our sermon lesson for today is from 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Damim between Soko and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight me and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I'm not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, and put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from its sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. This is God's word. I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that that's not the first time you heard that story. Even if you haven't heard it in all of its detail, like I just read to you, it's a very long story. In fact, we had to cut out some verses to make it even fit. It's such a long chapter that gives vivid detail of this story. Even if you haven't heard all of that detail, I'm sure you've at least heard references to the story. This story is one of those that has kind of made its way into our culture, into our vernacular, and so you hear references to it whenever an underdog defeats a seemingly invincible opponent. When the 16 seed in the NCAA tournament pulls off the upset against the 1 seed. It's a David and Goliath story, right? This is one of those stories that we've all heard before. And I would also guess that this is probably a story that many of you have heard a sermon preached on before. Because how can pastors resist the pull of this story, right? There's so much in it that's amazing to preach on. The fear versus courage motif, the almost mythical description of Goliath and his strength, this 9-foot-tall warrior who has armor that weighs 125 pounds and a spear that has just the tip of the spear weighed 20 pounds. This mythical, almost mythical figure named Goliath who stands against David and the Israelites and mocks their God. There's so much in here. And so as you hear this story, I think you already have an idea of where this is going to go, right? There are some texts that I stand up here and I read the sermon text and I can tell by the look on your face as soon as I get done reading them, you're kind of confused. You're not even sure what the text means, let alone how it's going to apply to your life. You look at me like, all right, Pastor, what are you going to do with this one? But this text, you know, right? As soon as I read it, you're transported back to 1000 BC. You see yourself standing there, crouching down and picking up those 5 smooth stones from the stream, and you're ready. You're ready to go and face your giant. Now, maybe the giant for you is not a 9-foot-tall Philistine. Maybe it's that stack of bills that's starting to creep dangerously close to 9 feet tall. Maybe for you, the giant, your fear is crippling anxiety or self-doubt that keeps you from being the person that you want to be. Maybe your giant is cancer or loneliness or addiction. Whatever it is, we all have these fears that seem of almost mythical proportions, where we imagine them in our mind and we read this story and we think that we're going to be like David and we're going to step out and face our giants. Now, if that's all I gave you in this story, I would be a bad pastor. And I don't want to be a bad pastor. I actually would prefer to be a good pastor. So I'm not just going to give you David's tips and insights and applications for how you face your fears. Because if I did that, then maybe, if I'm inspiring enough, if I really fire you up, maybe you would have the courage to go out and face your giant. Maybe, if I'm really inspiring, you might even actually win. You might get your finances in order. You might have the courage to face down that mountain of debt, and you'll start getting your finances in order. You'll start coloring in your Dave Ramsey debt snowball, and you'll start to get that under control. Maybe you'll take a leap, and you'll put yourself out there, and you'll find a community of people around you that can help you feel less lonely. Maybe you'll start going to meetings for your addiction. Maybe you'll start avoiding that certain substance. Maybe you'll go out and you might actually defeat this giant that's staring you down. But the problem is that kind of courage wears out very fast, because basically what it is adrenaline. If you get really amped up, maybe you'll have the courage to go and face your giant, but the thing is, when one giant falls, there's always another behind it. And over time, as those fears keep coming, you'll lose courage and you'll lose strength. Because no matter how good of an example you have, there are always going to be giants that you can't defeat. You get your finances under control, and what happens is you start trying to rein in your spending and control the things that you can control. All of a sudden you realize that there are a lot more things that no amount of budgeting can prepare you for. There are certain things that are uncontrollable in your life, and that makes you afraid. As you start to find friends to help you with your loneliness, what you realize is that, sure, you have friends now, but those feelings of inadequacy in you that loneliness had created over time, those feelings are still there. You start to deal with that addiction, and maybe you even avoid the substance you've been struggling with, and now you're left to deal with the underlying cause of that addiction. See, what we often fail to realize is that beneath the surface level fears that we have are even greater fears. What we're afraid of with our finances is really the fact that we're not in control, right? That unexpected things happen all the time. As we try to plan our future, we really don't know what's going to happen the next day or the next year or the next 10 years. We can't know because we're not in control, and that scares us. Those feelings of inadequacy that we feel in our relationships, they come from a deep-seated fear that maybe we're not enough in the eyes of God. The feelings of, or the things that lead us to addiction are unresolved trauma and guilt that make us feel like we can't bear the pain of life without numbing ourselves toward it in some way or another. And so as we start to really dig into our fears, what we find out is that there are some fears that really do taunt us, that make us cower in fear, that make our knees knock together, like the Israelite soldiers when Goliath was taunting them. There are some fears that we are not equipped to face on our own. We can try to put on the best armor we can, like Saul trying to give David his armor. He says, I'm the king. This is the best armor that money can buy. Here, try this on. And we can try to arm ourselves for combat. We can try to listen to podcasts and read the latest books and study up on the psychology and the neurology of all these things. But in the end, nothing can really prepare us for a battle like the ones we face. A battle against an undefeatable giant. That's why I love what David says in verse 45. He doesn't focus on how prepared he is. In verse 45, he says, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you." He doesn't say with a sling and a stone, even though that's what he was armed with. And a sling and a stone is not a bad weapon. And in fact, some people say in that time period, for some people, a sling and a stone was a more effective weapon than a bow and an arrow. It was a length of cord that went around a piece of leather. And so it was about 18 inches of an extension on your arm. You think about how fast an MLB pitcher can throw a baseball. You add 18 inches of leverage onto that. You can get a stone moving pretty good with that thing. It's a good weapon. But David doesn't say, I come against you with a sling and a stone. He says, no, my strength, my courage doesn't come from my weaponry. It doesn't come from how prepared I am for battle. My courage comes from the fact that I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. Excuse me. The God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. See, when David stood face to face with an unconquerable giant, he didn't stand there with courage because of his own strength or how well equipped he was. He stood there with courage because of the God who was with him. He says that in verse 47. He says, all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. And so with that, he took that sling and that stone, and he conquered that unconquerable giant. He saved Israel from the giant who was terrifying them, who was defying God and his people. Without a sword in his hand, the narrator says, David killed that giant. And what that goes to show you is that you can have, like Goliath, you can have the best physical qualities, the strongest armor, and the best weaponry, and you still don't stand a chance against the power of God. See, what this story is an example of is an ancient practice called battle by champion. Goliath kind of explains it in the first part of our reading. He says, you come out and face me. Instead of having all these casualties of two armies fighting against each other, just go one-on-one. So Goliath said, you come out and face me, and if I win, you'll be our slaves. If you win, we'll be your slaves. In other words, this is what Goliath is called, that word at the beginning of the reading. He's called a champion. This was a custom for him to be the champion who went out on behalf of his people. What that word means in Hebrew is it means a man of the middle space. In the space between the two armies, Goliath would step forward. And he would say, I'm going to fight on behalf of all of my people. And David stepped forward and he said, I'm going to fight on behalf of my people. And so David's victory would be Israel's victory. Goliath's victory would be the Philistines' victory. One man fought on behalf of all the people. And that's what this story is meant to show us, is this idea of one person fighting on behalf of the people. And so as tempting as it is to look at this story and to see David and to think he is the champion, he is the one that this story is about, what David would have us realize is that the real champion of this story is God. He says, I come against you in the name of the Lord of Israel. He says, the battle, it's not mine, the battle is the Lord's. And so he stepped out into the middle and he showed us that there is nothing in the world that can stand against God and his power to save. And so what we see from this story is not David's courage, although we do see that. What we're meant to look at is the power of God. The same God who was with David and delivered Goliath into David's hands, that same God sent the son of David into this world as our ultimate champion, as the man of the middle space who stood between us and all of our enemies and fought for us, who went into the wilderness to fight toe-to-toe with Satan for 40 days and 40 nights, to go up against all of the temptations that we face, the same temptations toward doubting God, toward trying to find a more comfortable life for ourselves at the expense of other people, the temptation to grab power for ourselves. Jesus faced all of those same temptations, and for 40 days and 40 nights, he resisted. And even beyond that, for the rest of his earthly life, he was resisting Satan's temptations at every turn, right up until the day when he went one step further than doing what David did. David put his life on the line. He risked his life for the sake of the Israelites as he fought for them. Jesus gave his life for us. He let himself be killed so that on Easter morning he could rise from the dead and conquer the greatest giant we will ever face, death. And because this is battle by champion, Jesus' death is our death. His victory is our victory. His resurrection is our resurrection. And that's what gives us courage as we go out to face our fears like David did. See, when David told Saul that he would go and fight on behalf of the people, Saul said, no, you can't do that. You're this young man. He was probably less than 20 years old, because that's what age you were allowed to fight. And so he says, you're this young man. Goliath is this trained warrior who's been fighting since his youth. You can't go up against him. And you remember what David said? He points back to his past. And he says, I may not be a warrior. I may not have fought a 9-foot tall giant before, but when I was in the fields and a lion or a bear attacked. These wild animals who, by all accounts, should have overpowered me and killed me. I survived because God was with me. David looks back to his past. He remembers how God has delivered him before, and that's what gives him courage to step forward and face his fears. And so that's what we can do too, as we look back at the giant of death that God has defeated for us. As we look back and we see that we don't have to feel lonely because God has sent Jesus into this world to rise from the dead, to promise that He is always with us, and then to surround us with fellow Christians who are here for us every day. As we look at how Jesus slayed our giant of fear and uncertainty about the future by promising us an eternal life with Him in heaven. Like we sang in the second song, we know how our story ends. We'll be with Jesus forever. As we look back at the past and we see what God has done for us, that's what gives us courage for the future. I don't know what giant it is that you're facing today. You may be staring down something that feels undefeatable. It feels invincible. But know this, your God has delivered you from worse in the past. And your champion goes before you to fight for you. He fights on your behalf, and so you don't have to be afraid at your inadequacy or at your lack of preparation, because the battle isn't yours. The battle is the Lord's. And what we see in this story is that there is no amount of power, no amount of fear, no amount of terrifying things that can stand against the power of God. What we know is that because we have seen Him deliver us in the past, we can trust God and have courage for the future, because the battle is the Lord's. Amen.